Thank you very much. Well, he said he didn't do that much justice with the name. It's actually Oba Dokum Thomson. I'm the Oloni of Eti-Oni in the state of Osun in Nigeria. Interesting, I must say, especially when you're put to speak behind two professors. Now, it can get very, very challenging. But I'll try and take advantage of that situation whereby they've helped to lay down some nice groundwork to be able to start, to be able to give my address. What I would say first is to thank the organizers for making this event possible. For me, we've been around the world all day, and we're now in sub-Saharan Africa. So, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I feel honored to have been invited to speak at an event such as this, to lend a voice from an African perspective. First, to correct the several misunderstandings of who an African is. Secondly, how an African sees and understands the rest of the world. And thirdly, what the rest of the world needs to know about modern Africa to positively engage Africa to achieve lasting peace and sustainable development. The topic that I'm actually speaking on, I want to say the full thing. Is the cultural diplomacy from the African perspective as a panacea for peace and development. When Africans, especially where I come from, when we speak in a lot of proverbs, in a lot of statements, and then we now try and explain what we mean by such proverbs. And I will continue my address by explaining this. There's a proverb in Africa that simply translates to understanding individual traits and characters of people and responding to them accordingly prevents rancor, bitterness, and misunderstandings that usually lead to conflicts. It goes further that when two brothers go into a room to discuss very crucial and important issues, it is said that when they come out smiling, it means they had lied to each other. Rather than speak the truth to each other, they must have swept all issues under the carpet for fears of not wanting to hurt each other's sentiments or sensibilities, only for these issues to rear up their ugly heads in the near future and possibly consume them both at that time. On the other hand, when they come out in frowns and red eyes, it means that they have spoken the hard truth to each other. It is said that truth is bitter, but definitely it does set one free. This would create better understanding for mutual respect and sustainable love towards one another. It is on this premise I would be speaking this evening, not for us to come out of this conference in frowns, but to embrace one another in truth, love, and peace as each other's brother's keeper for the good of humanity. Africa, as we all know, has very rich and powerful culture, which is at the very root and foundation of the several identities of our many peoples, similar to the many different people across different locations, across different geographical locations around the world. These differences in several ways gave rise to bilateral trade, strong global economies, the need for global cultural exchanges that led to tourism, modern education, and even advance in technology developments, with the world described as a global village. On the other hand, on the other side, these differences in culture or creed have been the very source of sorrows, hate, oppression, and wars, when not sincerely discussed and pursued for the mutual benefit of all. With the level of wars, fears, terrorism, hate, and so on across the world today, I believe it is safe to say that political diplomacy cannot address these complex issues and challenges, but cultural diplomacy, which appears complex yet simple in its makeup, is the only process that can resolve these crises to fashion a way forward to achieve global peace and sustainable development. Why did I say this? Culture, as we know it, always brings about reverence, joy, happiness, hope, togetherness, smiles on the faces of people, and most times celebration, while same cannot be said for politics. Democracy, which is the world's accepted form of governance, that is, government for the people, by the people, may have worked perfectly in some parts of the world because at the onset they were able to fashion a common ground between the ideals of democracy, their origin and identities of culture over many years. But in Africa, democracy appears to be abused because the African culture and values were not incorporated into the democratic process, but rather seemed foisted on the people within a very short period without full understanding and appreciation of its import and disregard of the consequences by those who foisted democracy on Africa. There are several cries by Africans and Africa for solutions to our problems, but the many misconceptions and lack of understanding of the African values have made it challenging to understand how to support and address these situations. Today's contemporary world has created a situation where everyone has to watch their own backs. But there is an African saying that translates to mean, one can afford to have a saw in one's back because one has a mother. When the Commonwealth is looked at as a big family, the United Kingdom is looked at as the mother expected to watch the backs of all her children, but that is not the case. For instance, during the days of apartheid, some nations, seeing the inhuman treatment of their brothers, led the protest for the boycott of the 1986 Edinburgh Commonwealth Games, so that apartheid could be outlawed with an independent and free South Africa for all to be equal. The response of the United Kingdom to this peaceful protest was to stop the free movement into the UK of the citizens of these Commonwealth nations, while the United Kingdom makes a lot of money on visa applications from the citizens of these nations, irrespective of whether the application was successful or not. On the other hand, countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand are not subjected to these discriminatory acts. In addition, the strongest ally to the United Kingdom is the United States of America. which is not in the Commonwealth, even though was once a colony of Great Britain. This leaves one to question the actual meaning of the equality within the creed of the Commonwealth. The world has defined Africa by the several and different forms of disunity and challenges. Xenophobic attacks on brothers, genocide due to differences in ethnicity or religious ideologies, numerous health epidemics and problems faced daily by Africans, issues of hygiene and environmental degradation, girl-child abuse and illiteracy, wars and further threats of war, worsening social and economic conditions, poverty in the midst of plenty, inhabitable dwellings and the complete collapse of our cherished values, dwindling ability and lack of capacity to acquire and improve on skills for economic empowerment and technology advancements. But in actual facts, Africans are not troublemakers, but it is the trusting, gentle, and hospitable nature that got us from slavery into colonialism, into apartheid, and finally where we are today. An African is always hospitable to visitors and welcoming to strangers, displaying brotherly love to one another. Africa is probably the only part where you would have communities take up the responsibility of looking out for the good of one child and even contributing money to educate one child, irrespective of gender. Unity was our watchword, and contempt for leadership was incomprehensible, while disrespect for elders was an abomination. The family structure was sacrosanct and respected, and we were taught that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And most important, our love and worship of God should be in spirit and in truth with the scepter of righteousness. That was Africa. And even today, we see Africans excelling in different fields across the globe. What is required is to translate these individual pursuits into one wholesome solution for the benefit of all. In concluding, there is a saying in Africa that translates to mean, it is from within that beauty can be displayed outwardly. Or, before any public display of one's goodness, such a person must ensure that the home front is well taken care of. In other words, you cannot give what you do not have. The Commonwealth needs to address the inequality amongst member nations, forge better and improved brotherly relationships that will build the necessary bridges among these member nations as the prerequisite to building solid bridges with the rest of the world to create a lasting and effective solution towards peace and sustainable development for the good of all. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much for a very thoughtful and important speech on a number of levels, and especially for representing also Africa in that sense. Even though I think sometimes it can be challenging to speak of Africa, given the tremendous diversity, I think it's really important. And what I'm always saying from a cultural diplomacy point of view, we need to really recognize the complexity with Africa, how the political map doesn't really say much about the cultural map, and even Nigeria in that sense. I mean, for me, it's always, well, what is Nigerian identity? You know, you've got, I think, 300 languages, if not more. And I think there one needs to really make sure that one understands that complexity in terms of zooming into the personal identities and then also zooming out in terms of sub-Saharan Africa identity, which you began with, or even Africa as a whole. So some really important contributions, and I'm sure you've inspired questions and comments from all of us. So I'd love to invite the questions and comments of us all and to engage in the very honorable opportunity we have to have dialogue with His Royal Majesty. Who would like to go first? Questions or comments? And as always, if you could briefly introduce yourself when posing the question or making the comment. Yes, okay.
Hello, thank you very much for a lovely speech. And I appreciate that we don't know much about Africa. In fact, I learned now that the Commonwealth are discriminating against Africans, which is I didn't know before. Having said that, has the African themselves discriminating about Europe, or there is different levels of discrimination between Africans themselves? Thank you.
In every society, there's a level of discrimination. Even in families, we can call it discrimination or favoritism, whatever. But in Africa, there's no real apparent discrimination that is visible when you're looking at Africa and Europe. You're probably, when it comes to what you call discrimination in Africa, it's what I can just describe as a situation whereby two people want the same thing, and everybody comes in with one particular, well, they come in with different kinds of strategy to get the same, they get that one thing. So it's not real apparent discrimination, but it's just interest that is being served.
Can I say something? I lived in Nigeria for several years.
Okay.
My husband was teaching at University of Benin, and I was working there with the publishing group. I loved Nigeria.
Thank you.
It was many years ago. It was much more chaotic than today. But I loved the people and what they did. What I would say generally lacking in Nigeria per se, but in Africa as a whole, is good governance. That's lacking very, very badly. You know, people are good, they're intelligent. I was flabbergasted that every single person, smallest person, will buy a newspaper in Nigeria. You know, my driver read more newspapers than me, you know, when I was in Nigeria. Everybody wants to learn, and they're very anxious. There were 52 higher education institutions even then. So I was very impressed with their intellect, with their ability to, you know, to want to learn everything, and their kindness. And I love their culture of sharing and giving. But really, really good governance is lacking. Almost every country of the world. But I felt then, so many years ago, much more strongly in Africa. I wasn't only in Nigeria. I was traveling all over West Africa and Central Africa. So therefore, for my company. But I feel the good of Africa has not been translated here. We do not see that. My children, they were this little when they were there. Up till today, they stand up for Nigeria. They say, oh, Nigeria, they're all crooks. No, not everybody is crooks. No, I've lived there, and they're like this and like that. What I'm trying to say is, unless you've lived there, unless you know something about their culture and their heart, you don't know much except what you hear here and there, you know? So therefore, your cultural diplomacy is lacking, isn't it? We need to really bring it out there, you know? Bring it out there, show it to people, what you can do and beautiful, the chieftain system, like you're called, for example, you're called Oba, Oba, is it?
Yeah.
Oba. Yeah, that's therefore, there's so respectful figures there. It's like a community leaders are so wonderful. If that system was here, it would be much, much better, our society. But it's not translated here. Nobody knows about it.
You see, the thing there is, you have to appreciate where we're coming from. Good enough. Well, I can say we probably have started a bit late, 56 years after independence from colonialism. Within that 56 years, we've had close to 40 years of military rule, dictatorship. The entire value structure was destroyed. So, and it's reoccurred twice. We are now trying to pick up again. This is the first time we're going to have 17 years of uninterrupted political rule, or democracy. So, and definitely the people that have the funds to run campaigns, that's another unfortunate thing. Our political system is structured similar to the US system, which is a very, very expensive model. Yeah. And you have to have money to be able to run for office. And the only people who have participated in the military rule, either as businessmen or probably military dictators, are the only ones that have empowered to be able to fund such expensive ventures. But I believe seeing me here is a sign of some good things to come, because you will probably not see a traditional ruler come in the open to speak in public, right, about what's going on in Nigeria, or even to speak about what they need to do for things to change. No, it's not done. It's never done.
Yeah, I think you said something about that this morning. To show the truth is a much better thing, because then we can, when I say to you, I'm really suffering, help me, you respect me, And I said, no, don't worry about it. If you show our vulnerability, then we can be much more, if you like, much more sympathy and much more understanding. The moment we say, we're all right, don't worry about it. Nigeria, big country, very rich country.
Yeah,
how it's perceived.
Mm-hmm. In truth, it's not about sympathy. I mean, when we look at, but let's talk about equity. Let's talk about justice. Let's talk about fairness. And the system has not been fair so far, especially when we look at the Commonwealth. Not fair to everyone. If you go further back into the histories, who enforces the treaties? How do you say, what does it mean to be independent? What treaties were signed? These treaties were just straight treaties, not the treaties that suppresses you, or treaties to oppress you, or to give you ownership. You were never given ownership. So I still ask the questions. Freedom from what? Independent from what?
But it is Africa's second richest nation, isn't it? Both culturally and financially.
Financially, after we've spoken a lot about terrorism today. We've spoken about the 9/11. After the 9/11, there were laws that came in terms of money laundering issues for cause of terrorism and stuff like that. KYC by banks. But London City is home to stolen funds. It's home to corrupt funds. No, not Switzerland anymore. This is the home to the biggest. This is home to what, the most No, stolen funds, public funds from every single poor country. So, funds, you're looking at, when you say offshore, you're looking at probably just the cash. But what about the property? The property market is owned by mainly foreigners, and their countries are suffering. So really, they found an ally or a partner in this country.
I mean, that's normal business.
It should, well, but they wrote the laws. They are the ones condemning in the open corruption. They are the ones condemning abuse of office and stuff like that. But then,
I'm going to give you an example about what you're talking about now. I'm coming from Spain. It is a country that the economy was based in construction, the real estate. The politicians, they approve a law that if a forest or a land is under fire, once of course the fire is not there anymore, the state, the government is free to give that land to the real estate companies and build whatever there. So the point is like, well, it's legal, yes, but it's moral, is that moral, you know?
yeah.
So,
But you know, in Nigeria, we have a statement for everything, or in Africa. I'll tell you what they say. They will say, the same European or Caucasian who invented the pencil also invented the eraser. So in other words, for everything they say you can't do, they've created a backdoor for you to be able to do it.
Can you give some examples about London? You said something for London. Can you give some practical, real examples?
You know better.
No. When I said about London, I said this is. Let me give you an example. For instance, I cannot remember the country, but there was an issue with Barclays Bank for taking a deposit, a certain amount of money. I think it was about 900 or 2 billion pounds or dollars, without the proper KYC. They were fined a certain amount of money, maybe $80 million, but the money was still sitting in the bank. That's London.
Now, Your Majesty, allow me to say something from the President Goodluck, because of course I get both sides. When the President Goodluck left, $4 billion was missing. Thank you. When President Goodluck left, $4 billion was missing because they changed the government, they changed the president. And they were coming to it very sad, and of course, President Goodluck is a very close kind of friend of mine. I met him some time ago. However, I'm not saying he take it, but I'm saying $4 billion. Where that $4 billion of the money of the poor people, which they're dying, where that is gone? And the government of here did not say any word. Just came to on the news, $4 billion missing the second day. It just covered. What happened to that for? I know, but I'm saying, where that $4 billion of poor people, money of the poor people?
You know the truth about, I would say something about that. I'll just add something to that. We don't really know these figures. He was accused of this and accused of that, but it was never proven. Not that I'm speaking for him or I'm an advocate for him, but there's so many issues that came around during the campaign, and well, things have changed now. Nobody has been able to say this. The UK is not even saying this.
That's right.
The only thing.
UK say it? I don't understand it.
Oh,
No.
in politics.
Why are they responsible?
Responsible.
Because the money is
The money is in this system.
here.
But the money deposited.
Money is here.
No, the money is deposited here in the UK.
But even a criminal's money you can't take that. It's
Let me give you another example. Let me give you another example. Abacha, one-time military dictator, has a lot of money in Switzerland to be returned. They've been returning this money bit by bit. It's in the billions. And only recently, there was, I think, a portion of about $600–700 million or 800. I'm not sure. I can't remember.
Pocket money.
Yeah, exactly. It was actually pocket money. The Swiss government comes and says, oh, before we return the money, come and write down to us what you're going to do with the money. It's not your money. You don't give conditions to the owner of the property before you return the money. If it gets stolen again, let it get stolen again, but bring it back, return it. But don't give those kind of conditions. And this money that has been with Switzerland has been, General Abacha died in, no, 1997, yes. And all these things were resolved by 1999 that he had so much amount of money in Switzerland, 17 years after, not returned, only a fraction of it. Sorry?
Did he took it with him when he died?
Well, the custodians are probably happy that he died so that they can keep it.
I'm just saying that these are bank things. They're not people's things. Bank is not an animal. It's not,
Oh no, we know.
With nations.
We know that, but they have they have regulators,
Yeah, but
which is the government.
why do you have regulators in Nigeria?
No.
Not to steal.
I'll tell you. No, it's not the most important thing. In law, the thief and the handler of the stolen goods are both criminals.
It's not handler, it's just people.
Can we
No.
go back without the debate?
In law.
The professor, please.
Just one question. How much influence do the traditional rulers have over the governments?
Very excellent question. I'm not sure how well you know the history of Nigeria. Okay. Before the colonialism, each of these communities were separate sovereign kingdoms. Okay. When the British came in, what they did was to have some sort of treaties with all these kingdoms and had the indirect rule system whereby they ruled through the traditional rulers for ease of administration. After Nigeria was created in 1914, which translated to independence in 1960, the traditional institutions were kept, and the political democracy or democratic institutions were also kept line in line. So what the traditional rulers do is they're the original landowners, they have their kingdoms, and they're responsible. Their first responsibility is peace, order in these communities, and to a great extent, they also look out for the development of these areas. During the politics or campaign, the first port of call by politicians is always exactly. And after that, it's a different ballgame. But what we try to do is to sort of partner for progress, for development purpose. And one way or the other, Nigeria has been able to stabilize that relationship over this last 56 years.
What did the new generation can do to improve the situation in Nigeria? And another question, what is the government doing regarding terrorism like Boko Haram?
The first one, in terms of the new generation, we're moving out. There's a lot of like a boom in the cultural aspect, trying to modernize it, create entertainment, to educate themselves. And some of us are also engaging the younger generation, because Nigeria actually has the largest, in terms of median youth age, probably have the largest and probably would have the largest in the world in another 20, 30 years. We have a population of about 180 million people, and half of that is below 18. So by the time we can get these people educated and exposed through platforms like this, cultural democracy, then over a time the system can evolve to something that everybody can be proud of. Not that we're not proud of it now. We are proud to be called to be Nigerians and everything. In terms of the security issues, that has gone down considerably, but different organizations, the church, the mosque, even Islamic scholars and Christian scholars are coming together regularly for interfaith meetings to engage and educate the public so that people don't get into extreme situations whereby they can be deceived to join any kind of extremist groups.
Quite a lot have come back. Quite a lot of victims are found. I heard
From
quite a lot of victims of Boko Haram are being helped now.
The girls.
yeah. Within the IDP camps and the rest of them, the displaced people and stuff like that, yeah.
I just wanted to make a comment too before, I'll give it to you in a second, regarding cultural diplomacy in Africa. You made some interesting points before. First of all, in terms of discussing weaknesses instead of strengths, really important. I mean, up until now, cultural diplomacy traditionally was about strengths. I want to show you how strong my country is. I want to show you the best movies, the best music, etc. But as you said, if our goal is to build trust, that actually makes it more difficult. If I come to you, I'm an arrogant, and I tell you how great I am, this and that, okay, but is that really? But if I come to you and I say, hey, here are my strengths, here are my weaknesses, here are my successes, here are my failures. And in an honest way, in a humble way, I recognize my own imperfection as a culture, as a country, etc. It can be a great base. So it doesn't happen so often in cultural diplomacy, but I think it's definitely essential, especially when engaging countries where there's bigger differences, culturally, geographically, etc. The second point I wanted to make is actually from, I believe, Turkish folklore, but I think it applies also to Africa, where there's a proverb that says, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We have to listen more. And I think it was actually the foreign minister of Mozambique told me that. I think it was 5 or 6 years ago from Mozambique. And I think it's very relevant for diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. In my opinion, I think the future of cultural diplomacy will be much more a cultural diplomacy about listening than speaking. Mm-hmm. If I want to build trust with you, first I have to listen. First, I have to show respect. First, I have to come to your culture, get to know. And I think that's the job of cultural diplomacy, not just to have, let's say, Americans sending American movies to Nigeria, but let's go and let's bring Nollywood to the USA. Let's support local artists there. Let's show the respect. Let's give voices to voices that maybe are not heard. So that might be another thought for how a different kind of engagement with Africa. And maybe the final point I'll make, I think within Africa, I see a tremendous need. It's not just a matter of flight schedules. If you see the flights between Nigeria and other countries, there's many more going to Paris and the rest of Europe than to other African countries. And I think it's a big issue in the sense really to connect Africa with itself physically, just in terms of transportation, but also I think mentally, culturally, etc., that we can really see, are we working together as a team or not? And I think you have African Union, a few attempts here and there, but really there's a long ways to go. And I think that would really strengthen the region as a whole as well. So perhaps another opportunity to engage more cultural diplomacy within Africa.
Yeah,
so just a few thoughts. I'll just saw a hand in the back here as well.
Hi. Hiya. I'd like to just ask you a specific question because you're the ideal person to ask it to, really.
Okay.
It's always seemed to me that part of the presentation or constructing of Africa or Nigeria in particular, as corrupt, is inverted commas,
Okay.
has its stems from a cultural dissonance between different kinds of law. What I'm thinking of in particular is law around land and ownership, where you have a chieftaincy system with particular legal traditions and particular ways of conflict resolution that is based in particular understandings of land and access to land, rights over land, at the same time as you have a state that is trying to operate in a transnational legal system that has a very different understanding of law and contract law and ownership and exclusive rights to land. And it's always seemed to me, and I might be wrong in this, but I've always assumed that people like you would have a really tough job balancing up local chieftaincy law with property law as operated by companies that come in and want to lease land, or multinational companies that want to come in. And am I right in thinking this is a problem? One, if it is a problem, what do you do about it? Do you find that you have to use traditional law and legal structures to trump contract law, or do you find that inevitably the expense that you have to use international contract law or state law to trump local law, or do you, and this was always the really interesting proposition to me, do you manage to find cultural hybridizations where you manage to combine the two and preserve local chieftaincy, and you manage to combine that with contract dealings where you've got lawyers each other that no one locally can afford? How do you resolve this?
Funny enough, you've actually answered the question yourself. There is a way that the system, one way or the other, has created some sort of hybrid between the local and the state law. Okay, I'll give you an example. For instance, the state law based on mining states that the mining resources belong to the federal government. So they give you the rights or the license to mine in those fields if you have one. The person who is going to give you access to that area is the traditional ruler. If you don't get his consent, you can't do anything. Because that's the way they've sort of created that bridge to avoid exploitation of the community or the environment, to also create some sort of opportunities for the indigents of that community or the residents of that community, so that there is no apparent exploitation that the country or different locations across Nigeria has been experiencing or experienced during the colonial days. So once you get a traditional ruler, if you want land, if it's land issues, the traditional ruler will resolve most of it, because anyway, they're grants similar to international law anyway, because they're mainly, those lands are based on grants, complete outright ownership, not leased, but when the government wants a piece of land, then they come into some discussion and they sort of apportion the area they want, and they reach an arrangement or an agreement, and then a certificate of occupancy is issued for such land. But most times you find that sort of situation whereby it's strictly certificate of occupancy in the cities that were carved out earlier in the 60s or early in the 70s.
So we haven't got a situation where people like you are being eroded by state law. It is a working system. So
yes.
The way guarantees your place as mediator in this.
No, yeah, we're fine. I mean, we're not eroded in any form. Thank you. Do you have any interest in land?
I'm fascinated by it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I'm fascinated in the cultural grounding of legal systems.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Your Majesty, for an excellent and inspirational speak, and from your heart. God bless you, doing an excellent job for yourself, for your country. I know we have been a few times which we met. I find you are a very honest and excellent person, and may God make you president of the Nigeria one day. Round of applause. Round of applause for the King. Thank you very much, and God bless you.